seeing these stories are interwoven with each other. They're intermixed. They're not separate events from years apart. They actually are happening and occurring at the same time. And of course, in Ezra, it was not Ezra that led the people back from the Babylon. It was actually Zerubbabel was the governor who brought them back and began the work on the tabernacle. Ezra will be the one who finishes it. And so we go from Ezra, we jump to Daniel chapter 6, which was the story of Daniel in the lion's den. That, as far as we know, is the last event in Daniel's life where he is in a position of authority. He mentions in one of his prophecies that it was during the reign of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus. So this would actually be, we have Ahasuerus now, we have Artaxerxes next, and then the second Darius the second. And so, but it does not reference Daniel being in a position of authority at that point. So Daniel is still alive during this time. So King Darius' son is Ahasuerus, or as history knows him as Xerxes. Xerxes was the Persian king who tried to conquer the Greeks, who was stopped both by the Greek navy, but also he was held up by the 300 Spartans in the pass, and as a result of that, his army was defeated and he had to back off from trying to conquer Greece. That was Xerxes. Xerxes was a little bit insane. He considered himself to be God. There was one time when, and I mentioned this last week, but when there was a body of water, they built a floating bridge across, and as soon as they got it done, and it took months to build, I mean, it was a large enough bridge for him to march his army across, and shortly after they got it built, before he was able to cross it, a storm blew up and destroyed the bridge. So not only did he have the designers of the bridge executed, which obviously it wasn't their fault, but he did that anyway, but he actually literally had his soldiers take whips and go and whip the water for defying him. He was a little bit crazy, but he did consider himself to be God. So I say that to say that we need to understand Esther's position. When she became queen, this is the guy she's married to. This is King Xerxes, King Ahasuerus. He's always referred to as Ahasuerus in the scriptures. We're not sure why it's different, because the other names that are used, Darius, Artaxerxes, are always the same as the historical names. I'm not sure why there's a distinction here. But Xerxes is the only king that's not mentioned in this timeline during what we would call the historical references of the Persian kings, and the name Ahasuerus does not occur in the historical records, and again, the name Xerxes does not occur in Scripture, and they parallel at the same time. So as far as we can tell, this Ahasuerus is the same one as Xerxes. But anyway, that to say, he's a little bit crazy. He's got a temper. He banished his queen because she did something he didn't like. She defied him. So he banished her, and he made it a permanent banishment in the law, which in the law of the Medes and the Persians, once the king makes a law, the king was even bound by his own law. So he could not bring her back. So we saw this as setting the stage for the events of Esther's heroic defense of Israel, or of the people of Israel. And so he sent out, or his advisors recommended they would collect all the most beautiful girls in all the provinces. They would bring them to him. Basically, he'd have a night with them and decide which one he wanted to be his queen. That was how he picked. And it was I think it was about 4 years later, if I remember correctly. I think it was in his 3rd year of his reign that he banished Vashti was her name. And then I think it's in the 7th year of his reign where Esther is actually chosen. So there's a few years there where all this is going on. But the biggest thing we need to understand is that Esther was a Jew. Esther was an Israelite. And specifically, Jew is from the tribe of Judah. So technically the Jew does not include all Israelites, but it's because it was mostly those of Judah who were taken into the captivity of Babylon and brought back. Generically, we do refer to them as Jews, but technically they are from Judah. This is not all Israelites. But she's a Jew, and she has not revealed that. And her cousin, who is older than her, who raised her as if he was her father, her parents had died when she was young, he has a position in the palace. We aren't ever told exactly what his position was, or at least we haven't seen it yet. But he had a position where he would sit in the gate of the palace. Now, sitting in the gate of anything, whether it was a town, a palace, whatever, it meant that you had access to those of importance. You had a position in that area, in that realm. So if he had had a position in the town of Shushan, which was where the palace was, because we're not in Babylon anymore, because once the Persians took over, their capital was in Shushan. Now, we don't know with Daniel Daniel is still alive, but he is, as far as we know, he is no longer in a position of authority, or at least he's not mentioned in these events. And I would have assumed he would have turned up, but we do know he's still alive. He's also well over 100 years old at this point, so it may just be that he had retired from serving the king directly. But in Shushan, if Mordecai had sat in the gate of the city of Shushan, it would mean he was important in the city. The men of importance would go and sit in the gate, and that was like the place for people to gather if you needed to have a situation brought to like a small claims court kind of a scenario. You would take it to the gate of the city. You would have the elder men, the wise men of the city, hear your disputes, and they would make a decision. Now, if you didn't like the decision, you could pass that up. You could appeal that decision up to, in the Israelite culture, to the Levites, to the whatever the sanctuary city was that was close by. If you didn't like that, you could go all the way up to the Supreme Court, which was the high priest in that time. But other cultures had similar setups. But anyway, if he had been in the city, but the fact that he sat in the gate of the palace means he is in a position of importance. And again, we have seen multiple Jews in positions of importance. Daniel was second to the king multiple times, or at least in a very, very high position under multiple kings, under both Babylonian and Persian empires. We've seen Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego put in positions of authority. So here, having a Israelite in a position of authority is not abnormal here. And so Mordecai is in a position. Now, it does appear that Esther, it never says she chose to become one of these potential brides for Xerxes, for Ahasuerus. That says she was taken. So it doesn't say she was involuntarily taken, but it also doesn't say she went. So we assume that it was not entirely at their choice, that it was somewhat where the chamberlains or the servants were going out and selecting the most beautiful girls and literally taking them to the palace. And I mean, most of them would have considered that an honor, but it still was not necessarily voluntary. And Mordecai keeps up with her. It mentions that at the end of chapter 2, that every day he would stop by the women's palace, which he would not have been allowed inside. But he would stop by outside, and apparently they had some way to communicate. Either he could communicate with one of the guards, and she could leave messages, but they had some way of communicating. And so he was checking on her every day. So he is being a good father here, even though he's her uncle. He's taking care of her. Or whatever. It also talked about how she gained favor with everybody she came in contact with, including the eunuch who was over all the women. Now, it wasn't because she was a diva. In fact, it's the opposite. Because she wasn't a diva, it's because she wasn't constantly requiring things of him. She was gentle, she was kind, even in a situation she didn't want to be in. And so he actually would prefer her above the other girls because he liked dealing with her. She was nicer to be around. And so if he had to deal with any one of them, he's like, okay, he'd leave the other ladies and he'd be frustrated, and then he'd go and be able to deal with Esther, and she was gentle and she was kind, and so he preferred her above the others, and so he put her in a position of importance. And ultimately then when she had her night with the king, he also chose her as his queen. And again, that seems somewhat weird, but that is what happened. And that is what it says. So again, not a good position for Esther to be in. Probably involuntarily, she was taken from her home, put in the palace, and for at least a year, she had to prepare herself for this. She was taken in for one night with the king, which again would not have been according to the Israelite customs of marriage, etc. And he did choose her as his queen. But remember who the king is. This is Xerxes. He thinks he is literally a god, not the god, but a god. So having power over life and death. And he, again, is also a little bit crazy, and he has a quick temper. So when she has to go and approach his throne without being invited, it literally was, even as queen, it was her life at stake, and it was a dangerous situation to be in. But we haven't seen the fourth player yet. We've seen Ahasuerus, we've seen Esther, and we've seen Mordecai. But we haven't seen Haman yet. That's in the beginning of chapter 3. So in chapter 3, excuse me, it says, after these things, after Esther has become queen, did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. And all the king's servants that were at the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. Now, it doesn't appear that Mordecai is singling him out, but rather the Israelites had a fairly strong view of who you bowed to and who you didn't. And the king was in a position to be bowed to. Haman was not. Now, it does say that the king had commanded it, or at least had permitted it for Haman to require this, but Mordecai was not doing it. Verse 3, Then the king's servants which are at the king's gate said unto Mordecai, Why transgressed thou the king's commandment? And it came to pass, when they spake daily with him, and he hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's matter would stand. For he had told them that he was a Jew. So apparently, as part of his explanation for why he was not bowing to Haman, had to do with the fact that he was a Jew, therefore most likely had to do with Jewish law. He wasn't doing it because he didn't like Haman's background, because he would bow to the king, and the king was a Persian. So it's not that he would only bow to a Jew. But there was something in their training, in their teaching, that he said, no, I'll bow to the king, but I won't bow to the king's right-hand man. Verse 5, When Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, or realized it, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath. So the king wasn't the only one with a quick temper, Haman was as well. And he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had showed him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. Now, all through history, and this is just a good example of it, Satan has been trying to destroy the Israelites. He's been trying to destroy the Jews, primarily because he knew, as God had been prophesying for generations by this point, that the Messiah was going to come from the Israelite people, from the descendants of Abraham. And so, by this point, I believe there were prophecies starting to come out, because this is very toward the end of our timeline. There were prophecies even saying that it would be from Judah. So he is targeting not just the Israelites, although obviously if he can take care of all of them, that's fine with him, but specifically the tribe of Judah, the Jews, that he wants to have them wiped out. That's been one of Satan's goals all the time. He's still doing that, even though Christ has already come. The Jews are still God's chosen people, and Satan, in his losing war against God, he knows he's going to lose. His number one goal is to hurt God as much as possible, and since he can't touch God, he wants to touch those things that are closest to God. So anything that, well, humans being God's primary creation that were created in the image of God, every time a human goes to hell is a strike from Satan against God. It hurts God. Now, it doesn't hurt his position. It doesn't hurt the fact that he is God. It hurts him emotionally. God is not willing that any should perish. It is not his desire. God loved the world. That's why he sent Jesus. So even here, but this, of course, is before Christ. So if Satan can wipe the Israelites out, especially the Jews, Christ can't come, God's prophecy is vain, or is invalid. So Haman is being used by the devil, or used in the devil's plans, and when he finds out not only that Mordecai won't bow to him, but because he's a Jew he won't bow to him, he says, well, it's not worth it for me just to target one man. Now again, this is what vengeance does. Vengeance always tries to punish more than is appropriate. That's the difference between vengeance and justice. Besides the fact that vengeance is personal, justice is done by those that are in authority. Now, someone in authority can exercise justice on someone who offends them, who does something against them, who commits a crime against them. It is perfectly acceptable for a judge who is assaulted or whatever to press charges and have something taken to court. Now, in our system, they wouldn't stand trial because it's difficult to pass justice and not vengeance, but it would be appropriate. However, for those of us in personal situations, we're not supposed to exercise vengeance or justice. We're supposed to hand it off to those who are in that authority. Now, Haman's in a position of authority. He is in a position where he can exercise justice. It would have been just for him to take Mordecai to court over the fact that the king had said, bow to Haman, and Mordecai wasn't doing it. That would have been okay. That would have been justice. But Haman says, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to take out his whole people. If it's because he's a Jew, if it's because of the Israelite law that he won't bow to me, I'm going to take them all out. Now, what he does not know, nobody knows at this point, is that the queen is also an Israelite. And so Haman begins to come up with a plan. Verse 7, in the first month, that is the month Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, so Esther's been queen for about 5 years now, they cast per, that is lot, before Haman from day to day and from month to month, to the 12th month, that is the month Adar. And Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people, neither keep they the king's laws. Wherefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business, to bring it into the king's treasuries. And the king took his ring from his hand and gave it unto Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. And the king said unto Haman, the silver is given to thee, the people also to do with them as it seemeth good to thee. So now not only did Haman stretch the truth, now technically, yes, there was a people scattered throughout the provinces. They did have a different law. For the most part, they did follow the king's law as well. There were only a few exceptions where they wouldn't, where it conflicted with their law. But he's taking Mordecai's one offense, and he's stretching that to apply to all of the people, and he is making it sound a lot worse than it is. But not only that, just in case that wasn't enough, he bribes the king as well. He says, not only would I like this to happen, now this is the king's right-hand man. He has a lot of weight. He has a lot of pull with the king. But he says, not only does this need to happen, and it's hurtful to the king, but I will personally pay 10,000 talents of silver. That's a lot of money. I didn't calculate how much it was, but 10,000 talents was a lot of money. Haman was a wealthy man, and he's putting a great deal of his wealth into the destruction of the Jews. So he says, I will personally put the money in the treasury that then we can draw on to be able to accomplish this task, to pay to send out the messengers, to pay to hire the hitmen to go after the Jews, to pay for whatever needs to be done. Now, what the king says is the silver is given to thee. So Haman put the money in the treasury, and the king gave him access to it. But what that meant was Haman donated the money, but it was an official act of the kingdom for all these things to be paid for. Haman was not paying, technically speaking. The king had authorized it all. So that Haman wasn't paying for the messengers to spread the news about the destruction of the Jews. Haman wasn't paying for people to arm themselves or whatever else needed to be done in order to destroy the Jews. Technically, the king was the one paying for it. However, Haman, in a very sneaky way, covered the expenses so that the king wouldn't have to pay for it. So this is a classic manipulation scenario. The king, of course, doesn't really seem to have a problem with that. But Haman is willing to put a great deal. This tells you, again, how desperately badly he hated the Jews. This wasn't just he hated one man, but he had taken that hatred and he had transferred it to all of the Jews, and he was willing to pay. You know, they'll walking along the beach type of a thing, and you find a bottle and you rub it, and the genie pops out. You know, and so there was a businessman who had a similar hatred for another businessman, and he came upon a magic bottle, and the genie popped out and said, "I'll give you 3 wishes, but the catch is, your businessman across town, your opponent, will get twice of whatever you ask for." So he says, whatever you ask for, I'll give you. You have 3 wishes, but your opponent gets twice as much. And so the guy thinks about it, and so the first 2 wishes, you know, he asked for a larger store, a larger warehouse where he can house more goods, and, you know, of course, fully stocked and all that. And then the second wish was for some contact with some important business people that he was trying to establish business relationships with and stuff. And so the genie's like, okay, you can have both of those things, and of course your opponent has twice as much as what I've given you. And then his third wish was for half of his everything he had to be destroyed. Now, it was sneaky, it was clever, but he was willing to hurt himself to hurt his opponent. That's what Haman was willing to do. He's willing to take an immense amount of his own wealth just to destroy Mordecai. There is a great deal of hatred here. All right, so this goes on, verse 12. Then it were on the king's scribe, called on the 13th day of the first month, that there was written according to all that Haman had commanded unto the king's lieutenants. All that Haman had commanded unto the king's lieutenants, and to the governors that were over every province, and to the rulers of every people of every province, according to the writing thereof, and every people after their language. So again, this isn't just local in Shushan, this isn't even just local in Persia. This is going to every province, and they're translated into whatever language necessary to wipe out the Jews. Now, the Jews are still a minority even in Judah. They were not the primary governorship in Judah. Zerubbabel held position of governor. So even in Judah, this law would apply. It was under the Persian domain. So this literally not only would have wiped out all of the Jews in Shushan and in Persia, it also would have targeted the Jews in Judah as well. So it literally is an extermination, a genocide of the Jews. That's what's being done here. So they write it to every name, and in the name of King Ahasuerus was it written and sealed with the king's ring. Now again, Haman's doing all this. He has the king's ring. So he is signing it with full authority of the king to have this happen. Now what does that mean? This is now in the law of the Medes and the Persians, and the king himself cannot change it. Once it's sealed with his ring, he himself cannot change it. So once this is written, again, you think of how impossible this felt to the Jews. Their enemies have just been given full 100% permission by the government to kill on it. What they did is they targeted any Jew could be killed, no questions asked. That was what they were told. That was what permission was given for. Oh, and whoever killed the Jew could take all of their stuff as their own personal spoil of war. So it was very lucrative to go around and kill a bunch of Jews and take all their stuff. So even if people didn't necessarily dislike the Jews personally, anybody that was greedy, which again would have been a lot of people, would go after them and kill them just to gain access to their stuff. Verse 15, the posts went out, posts being the messengers went out, being hastened by the king's commandment, and the decree was given at Shushan the palace, and the king and Haman sat down to drink. But the city, Shushan, was perplexed. Now notice that. The city is perplexed. Now, Haman and the king sat down to have a drink, and they're like, whew, we got that done, party on. It's time to celebrate. We got something major accomplished. The city is confused. The city's sitting there saying, well, wait, why are we targeting the Jews? Why are we going after this particular people group? This law doesn't make any sense. What is going on? And so they're just confused. Again, the Jewish people probably had, those that were there probably had many people in positions of authority. You look at the Israelites wherever they go, including in the United States. And probably it has to do with the fact that they are God's people. I'm not ascribing any magic to them or anything of that sort, but God has blessed them. They are exceptionally good business people, even to this day. They are very good. And they get into positions of authority, but because of their strict laws, now I'm dealing with Orthodox Jews in particular that still follow the Old Testament law, because of their strict Old Testament laws, they're also very pleasant people to deal with. They're not going to try to cheat you. They're not going to try to take advantage of you. Now, they're shrewd. They're careful in their business, but they're not unkind, and they're not oppressive in their business. So they would have been good people to deal with. So the city, not only the city, but the provinces, but particularly the city, says, well, why are we targeting these people? They haven't done anything wrong. There is no reason to target a group of people that is, first of all, spread out all throughout the city and the provinces, but second of all, they're in positions of authority, in positions of prominence, and they have been decent people. They haven't been leading insurrections. They haven't been, they're not the gangs. They're not the lower quality people. These are people that are worth working with. So the city is confused. So chapter 4, when Mordecai perceived or found out about all that was done. Now, notice he perceived all that was done. That tells more than just that he heard the command. He heard the command, he read the report, he read the decree. They would have posted it, and they would have read it in conspicuous places, and then they would have posted it. So he not only probably heard the reading of it, because it would have happened in the gate of the palace, as well as the gate of the city, but then they would have posted it, so he would have been able to read it as well. So he not only figured out what was going on, but he figured out who was behind it. Because it says and he rent his clothes, put sackcloth on with ashes, and went out into the midst of the city and cried with a loud and bitter cry. And came even before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. So he came up to the king's gate, but he couldn't actually come into the palace anymore while he was dressed in sackcloth. It was against the law. Verse 3, and in every province, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree went, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Esther's maids and her chamberlains came and told it to her, and then was the queen exceedingly grieved, and she sent raiment to clothe Mordecai to take away his sackcloth from him, but he received it not. By the way, she does not know yet what happened. She is trying to help him out. She's trying to figure out why he's upset. She doesn't know the decree yet. Apparently, she wasn't in on any of it. She wasn't aware of any of it, and even when it was read publicly, because she was basically sequestered in her queen's house, she didn't find out about it. So Mordecai has to tell her, because she would not have responded that way had she understood why Mordecai was doing what he was doing. Because once he tells her, she doesn't push for him to come out of his grief anymore. She then realizes something needs to be done. Verse 5, then called Esther for Hathach, one of the king's chamberlains, whom he had appointed to attend upon her, and gave her commandment to Mordecai to know what it was and why it was. So she's okay, Mordecai, what's going on? Something unto him, and the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the Jews to destroy them. So Mordecai had done some research. Now again, he was connected to people in the palace. He was allowed to sit in the gate, which meant he was in a position of importance, of some sort of importance. And he was able to find out not only that Haman was behind it, but even how much Haman had paid into the king's treasury to get this done. So he has all that information. Verse 8, he also gave him a copy of the declare to her and to charge her that she should go into the king to make supplication unto him and make request before him for her people. So Mordecai says, okay, there's only one person in this scenario that can help us, and even that's a long shot. It has been established as law. The king himself can't change it. But if anybody can get the king to maybe help out, to figure out some sort of a solution, it would be Esther. Now again, she didn't want to be queen. She's married to a guy who is anything but a model husband. And yet she might be the only one that can help. Verse 9, and Hathach came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Then Esther spake unto Hathach and gave him commandment, and basically they go back and forth and to try to finish this chapter out basically without being called. And at the end of verse 11, she hasn't been called to the king in 30 days. So in a full month, she hasn't even seen him. She has not been called in to meet with him privately or publicly for 30 days. So she's like, it doesn't look good, in the next short period of time that we have, whatever couple of days or weeks we've got left, it's not looking good that I'm going to have an audience with the king. I mean, if I did, sure, I'd mention it to him. But no, I can't go in on my own. And Mordecai sends a message back and says, hey, you have to try. You have to go in and you have to do your best. But then in verse 13, Mordecai is commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. Now that's a little bit of an insult. That wasn't her point. But he says, don't think that you're going to be, the one Jew that's not going to be targeted. Somebody will find out. Somebody will talk. And there are enemies, even of the queen, who do nothing about it. Because in the king's own law, Esther could be killed without consequences. So once anybody found out that she was a Jew, she would have been killed. So he says, don't think that you're going to get away with this, that you're going to escape. Now, that wasn't her motivation, but he still says that. He also, again, you got to understand, Mordecai's upset. He's distressed. His entire people, including himself and his family, have been targeted. But then he says, for if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. Notice his confidence in that. The Jews are going to be rescued, Esther. Is it going to be you, or is it going to be someone else? But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed, and who knowest whether thou art come into the kingdom for such a time as this? Some of the more famous words in the book of Esther. It's his statement, this might be why you came into this position in the kingdom. Yeah, she didn't ask for it. She's picking from, she had nothing to do with the fact that he picked her, other than, she was nice and kind and she was doing her best, but it was the king's choice to choose her as queen. None of the concubines could have had a whirlwind's chance anywhere of going in and dealing with this. So only the queen had the opportunity. God was working through this, of course. So Mordecai says, hey, this might be why you were put in the position that you're in. In fact, after this event, we don't hear about Esther again. We don't know what happened to her. After she rescues the Jews in this scenario, she disappears from history. We have no idea. We don't know if she died of natural causes, if King Ahasuerus finally got fed up with her and had her killed or excommunicated. We have no idea. We don't know what happened to her. This is all we know about Esther, is these events. But Mordecai says, hey, you are in a position where you can do something, and it wasn't you that put yourself there. God put you there. Although, again, the name isn't in this book, the book of Esther. It says maybe it's for a reason. By the way, if you notice, the book of Esther is the only book in the Bible that does not have the word God in it. It does not reference Jehovah. Does not reference Lord. Any sort of deity in this is not referenced. And yet you can see it all the way through. You can see that God is working. You can see that they respect God, that they are looking to God. Because what does Mordecai say? He says the Jews will be rescued. Well, by who? Well, God said that the Messiah would come through the Jews, so it is impossible for the Jews to be wiped out. And Mordecai has confidence in that, but he doesn't say God will rescue us. I have a reason for that. I think I'll get to that in a second. But, so then Esther says this. She said, send Mordecai this answer, verse 16. Go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan and fast for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. She says, okay, I'll give it my best. I'll do it. Fast for me for 3 days. 3 days and 3 nights. Don't eat anything day or night for 3 days. Says I'll do the same thing here, and then I'll go into the king. Because if I get killed, and I died doing my best. I died, it's like a soldier going into battle. If anybody thinks that women can't be tough enough to be soldiers, most soldiers wouldn't have the courage to do this. But she says, it's my job, it's my duty, I will do it. Now, I'm not saying women should be in combat, but that does not mean they don't have the courage for it. So Mordecai went to his way and did according extremely heavily. Mordecai's faith obviously is not based in his people. It's based in God. The fact that God had said they would not be destroyed. Esther says, go and fast for 3 days. Well, what are you supposed to do while you're fasting? In Scripture, fasting is always tied with prayer. You don't fast just for the fun of it. This wasn't a diet. She wasn't saying, well, I put on a few extra pounds and I've got to shave it off before I can go see the king. That's not the point. When you fast, a dedicated fast like this, it is always to spend time in prayer and to show God that you are so serious about your request that you're willing to give up food for a period of time in order to show how serious. Now, this isn't a manipulation of God, but this is them saying, hey, God, we are serious. We are so serious about this that we are willing to deprive ourselves of the necessary daily food. In fact, the food and water says don't eat or drink for 3 days. Now, food we can do without for 3 days. Most adults can go 3 days and not. I mean, you get a little hungry. It's not that big of a deal. Water, though. Going for 3 days without water is just about all. You can actually go about 7 days without water before you die, but 3 days is a long time without water. And so she says, okay, do this for 3 days. But the implication there is so strong that you do this, but what did she say? Gather the Jews. Gather the Jews together, fast, and it's in parenthesis, it's implied, fast and pray for 3 days. Now, what happened to Mordecai at the end of the book of Esther? He's promoted into Haman's place. He is second in command, second to the king. Who wrote the book of Esther? As far as we can tell, Esther and Mordecai did. Under whose direction or whose authority? King Ahasuerus. King Ahasuerus thinks he is God. So probably, and this is my reason why I think that the word God does not appear in the book of Esther, even though it's so heavily implied, if they referenced another God pulling sway over the king, that would have ticked him off, which wasn't a good idea with Xerxes. So they wrote the book in such a way that God is never specifically referenced, and this would have been probably the official copy of what happened during these events. This is probably what went into the Persian books. At least this is my opinion on it. But because of that, they could not reference another God being greater than the gods of Persia. They could not reference another God being able to control events like this. And so they didn't even mention any God, but they implied it so heavily that we can see God all through the book, even though he's not ever mentioned. So they did an exceptional job of writing the book, because that's the thing, is that there's no reason to leave God out of passages like that unless there was a reason to leave God out of passages like that. And so that is what I believe happened, is that they wrote it as official persons of authority in Persia, and they couldn't put the Jehovah God in it. And so as opposed to watering it down, they just left it out completely, and we fill it in ourselves. But he's clearly there. There's no indication that they're not relying on God. He's so clearly through it, and yet they don't mention it. So what we have, of course, is the cliffhanger. The cliffhanger of any story is when you get up to the end and you're not sure what's going to happen next, and your hero or heroine is about to either die or succeed. In any good story, any good event system has that. And so we have here the classic good versus evil. We have Haman as the antagonist. We have Mordecai as the protagonist. We have Esther as the heroine, and Ahasuerus as the authority figure. He's not really good or bad in this. He's more bad, but he kind of does both sides. But he's the one that really is in charge of what happens. So we have all the events set up, and now we have this cliffhanger. And, of course, like any good story will do, I'll leave that till next week. But we'll get to find out what happens to Esther. Of course, most of us already know. But think about it from her perspective. You know, we've got a week until we go over this again. She was fasting and praying for 3 days. Fasting and praying for 3 days, not knowing if she would be alive by the end of the week or not. Not knowing if she would be executed for going to the king. Knowing that if she failed, humanly speaking, there was no other hope for her people. Knowing that, humanly speaking, now, of course, God would have brought a rescue in for them somewhere. Or at least some of them would have survived. God would not allow them to be completely wiped out. But World War II, he allowed a lot of them to get killed. So God does not always preserve all of them, but he preserves a remnant. But she knew that she was the only and best human chance for her people. There's a lot of weight to put on her, a lot of pressure. So as she gets ready to go in, we'll think about that. We'll read what happens next week. And her courage, her bravery, doing what is right in spite of being in a bad situation in the first place where she didn't even want to be. So we'll see that next week. Let's go ahead and close in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for Esther. Thank you for her courage, her good attitude, even in a situation where she didn't want to be. That despite of circumstances being outside of her control and looking completely hopeless, that she was willing to do what it appeared you wanted her to do, that she was willing to follow you to the death, and that she was willing to sacrifice herself for her people. I pray that you would give us that same kind of courage, that same kind of dedication to you and to serving you no matter where we are, no matter whether the circumstances we're in are good or bad, whether we like what's going on or not. We will continue to serve you.